Sir, CC Tucson, Alpha Squadron. Colonel, this is a question for you. Can you tell us about your career and how it relates to Tuskegee Airmen?
Okay, so the question was a bit about my career and how it relates to the Tuskegee Airmen. You know, and that's a great question. As I said earlier, for folks like me, like maybe most of us, the things that these guys were able to do and show to the country did not make an immediate difference for anybody. In many ways, they found themselves coming back and getting off the troop ship from Europe and still seeing signs that say whites this way, Negroes this way. And basically back into the same segregated kind of situation that they had left. But the contributions that they made kind of began, in many ways it was the beginning of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, because they basically opened the door, they basically kicked down the door, said, hey, it is possible, we can do anything, if we're given the opportunity to be trained to do it, we can do anything that anyone else can do. And so they were pretty much a shining example of what ought to be. And Truman and folks eventually desegregated the service and said, you know what, make it so, if we've got somebody that's a resource, then bring them in. And obviously this at the time was men, but the same message kind of continued to come through that, hey, you know, we need to take advantage of all of our capabilities, all of the folks that are out there, and eventually more and more roles began also to open up for women. And I think it was partly as a result of these guys saying, hey, you give me the chance and I can do that. And so more and more folks were given the chance and gave early that they could. So my career, I was sharing with a few of you earlier, Frank and I, who were fortunate to have breakfast with 15 to 20. I really enjoyed doing that. I said breakfast, it was lunch. But the bottom line is that my career, basically, I came on active duty in '74. I happened to, I did not go to the Air Force Academy. I actually went to a school back on the East Coast, I'm from LA, but I went to a college back on the East Coast called Cornell, and called Cornell. And I really appreciated having the opportunity to do that. And I didn't even appreciate it as I was initially applying, but I learned as I went through the application process, the guy that founded Cornell University, a guy named Ezra Cornell, back in the day, but his motto for the school is something that remains the same today. At that time, most colleges were segregated. And in fact, not just perhaps white only, but oftentimes they did not allow even Jewish people to attend. However, at this time when Ezra Cornell founded at the school, his motto was, I would found an institution where any person can obtain instruction in any study. It was basically the first Ivy League school to let in anybody. Male, female, black, white, Jewish, didn't matter. If you could get in, you were welcome. And so I'm glad to have attended that school, and it basically was a school that was pointing the way to, hey, here's the way things ought to be. And so I was glad to be able to do that. But eventually I graduated from that Reserve Officer Training Corps and went to pilot training and entered pilot training in '74. 32nd version of my career. I did pilot training, as I shared with some of your buds. I kept my boots too shiny, so they forced me to come back as an instructor pilot, because they said, hey, it'll be a good example for the troops. But I did that for a while as a T-38 instructor pilot. I flew F-4 Phantoms for a period over in Germany, enjoyed flying that airplane. That's a neat kind of a fraternity to be in. Then OV-10s for a short period of time. I went from there to, I was fortunate enough to get picked up at the test pilot school and went to Edwards Air Force Base and finished the test pilot school. I did a little bit of flight test in A7s and F5s, but the most of the time that I was there, I did flight tests in F16s, and I was doing various tests, both systems tests, performance tests, and what have you in the F-16. From there, I got picked up for an exchange with the Canadians, and I actually went to Canada. I spent 3 years at the Canadian Forces Base Cold Lake up in Alberta, Canada, at the Aerospace Engineering Test Establishment, which is their equivalent of Edwards Air Force Base. And so I was doing F-18 flight tests, and so I spent 3 years doing F-18 flight tests with the Canadians. I came back to the States, did a tour at the Pentagon, and then went back out to Edwards Air Force Base, where I was Chief of Academics and then Deputy Commandant of the Air Force Test Model School. And it turns out that I was actually Deputy Commandant, and the Commandant at the time that I was Deputy was Jimmy Doolittle, grandson of the Jimmy Doolittle that you'll hear more about as you go through your great studies about the Air Force. But the Doolittle Raiders that flew off the aircraft carriers and attacked Tokyo from aircraft carriers in airplanes that weren't designed to fly off aircraft carriers was his grandfather. So he was a fun guy to work for, but the problem was that in many ways he was like Frank. He loved to fly, and so he was always going off flying and doing fun things and leaving me to be in charge. So I was sitting around while he's out having a good time. But I flew F-15s there, instructing in F-15s, and then came here to Peterson Air Force Base in a space-related job and retired from that. I wound up going to another company, and folks talk about having great jobs and having the best job in the world. I had an excellent job. I was working for a company, and I was flying F-16s and Learjets for Veridian, an engineering services firm. And I was also, while doing that, I was instructing students of the Air Force and the Navy Test Pilot School. So I was bouncing back and forth between the Patuxent River on the East Coast and Edwards Air Force Base on the West Coast, instructing wannabe test pilots in how this is done, how you stay alive and get the data that you need and bring your airplane back. Eventually, the Air Force Test Pilot School, who owned that, their budget kind of got reduced, and so they asked me if I could train some military folks to do what I was doing, and so that was the handwriting on the wall. I knew what was going to happen next once they were all trained. So they could no longer afford to have a Veridian test pilot on staff, so I wound up getting moving over to the Dragon Flight Research Center, which is a NASA flight research center. It's now the Armstrong Flight Research Center, and I was basically doing research project management, aeronautics research project management, and the last year or so I was also doing flight research as a research pilot. So that is kind of where I went. And to circle back around to your question, how does my experience relate to the Tuskegee Airmen? From my point of view, it was all made possible because of the doors that these guys kicked down. So my hat remains off always to these guys who were there doing it, giving it their all, showing what they could do, and proving that, hey, this is possible. There's no reason for these doors to stay closed.